Okay, Chapter 12. Here's another tour, but this time we're going through the eukaryotic organisms pretty quickly. Emphasis on medically important ones. So here's a nice comparison of the three major domains. Remember, domains are the major classification, taxon, or ranking for organisms. Forget viruses at this point in time. So we have the eubacteria, the first column, the archaea, bacteria, just called archaea, and then the eukaryotic organisms, me, cats, fungi, algae plants, protozoa, all in the eukarya. And you can see if you look down the list, the first two, archaea and bacteria, are prokaryotic. Archaea and bacteria have circular, closed ring of DNA, double-stranded. Interestingly enough, you know that eukarya have histones. Well, you'll see them here. But rather oddly, the archaea bacteria also do, although regular bacteria do not. You know that organelles, you know that the nucleus is in a nuclear membrane, the DNA, in eukarya, but not in the other two groups, the bacteria and archaea. You know the bacteria have muramic acid and glucosamine. The two together make peptidoglycan, and it's only in the bacteria, but archaea don't have it. They all have ribosomes. What else is important? Plasmids in the prokaryotic bacteria, both groups, but not in eukarya. And I guess those are the main points. All right, so just a little bit on reproduction for the eukaryotic organisms. Histones. Let me take you to a picture. I just got to figure out where I put it. Right there. All right, so here's a cell, and here's a chromosome kind of pulled out and unstrung. And look at the histones that the DNA is coiled around. They're yellow. They look like little discs. And then, of course, you can see the DNA expanded to see the double-stranded with the bases. That's about all I wanted to show you. The eukaryotic cells divide in a variety of ways, asexually. Depends on the organism. Not going to get into it. And they also produce gametes and zygotes sexually. So again, you know mitosis and meiosis. Mitosis produces diploid cells just like the mother. Meiosis produces haploid gametes, like exospores in fungi are haploid gametes. Remember, diploid, full complement of chromosomes. For a human, for example, it would be 46. Haploid, half the number, 23. Remember that humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, 46 total. The haploid number would be 23, diploid number would be 46. And here's a comparison of mitosis and meiosis. You might want to stop here and get a better grip on the difference between them, remind yourself, but I'm going to go on. Just to look at different kinds of asexual reproduction, budding, different kinds of fungi. Most of the pictures are fungi. The view at the left in the middle is just showing you division into multiple daughter cells. It's called multiple fission. Many of the protozoa do that. You'll see an example coming up. You might remember malaria because you're going to see an example of that. Okay, so reminder of the domain, eukaryota or eukarya. Here are the kingdoms, protista, which are the protozoa and the algae, the fungi, the plant, and the animal. Okay, so the protozoa, just take you through. I don't think I need to go through every one of these words. I'll let you do it. I just mentioned malaria, so let me point out I got two pictures here related to malaria. You're looking at a blood smear up at the top. We've looked at them already in lab. And inside two of the red blood cells, you see a couple of strange things. Remember, red cells shouldn't have any observable thing inside of them. They don't even have a nucleus. So obviously they have two very odd things inside of them. These are plasmodium protozoa that are taking over the red cells. These things will divide by multiple fission into 20, 30, 40 daughter cells. And if you look at the picture down here at the bottom, this is a color-enhanced scanning EM. Right down here, there is a red blood cell. And these are all daughter cells that are being produced in multiple fission. What do we got? Maybe about 15 or so daughter cells that are being produced, and then obviously they will burst out of the infected cell, and that red cell is a goner then. So here's a look at some different protozoa. There's a really good website. You can see that website right there. As I hover over the link, it's part of the Centers for Disease Control. It's an excellent website on protozoa and worms if you happen to be doing a disease presentation on those two. It's got an alphabetical listing of diseases with all the info you might want. We're in the area called protozoology. These guys live everywhere. You tend to think of protozoa being in water. They are in both marine and freshwater, but they're also in moist soil. They are modal in a variety of ways. So up at the top right on dark field, you see an amoeba. You've seen them in lab. They move very slowly by pushing their cytoplasm around. It's called cytoplasmic streaming. The guy on the left in the EM, yellow and green, that's Giardia. You'll see him. No, that's Trichomonas, sorry. STD, protozoan. And you can notice that he's got 4 flagella, actually 5 flagella. There's one coming out the bottom. Then, the guys that have cilia, there are two interesting pictures at the bottom. Paramecium, you've seen him many times in wet mounts and such. And he is a ciliate. You can see cilia, particularly on the one on the right, all over him. But he's being eaten by a predatory protozoa that's also a ciliate. He's called Dindinium. And you're looking at two different views. One is electron micrograph on the right, and the other is a real high-power wet mount, just photomicrograph using bright field. But two ciliates, one going at the other one. Okay, shapes and odd things. Many of the protozoa insist, that is, when times are tough, they go into a resistant structure which protects them from the environment. In fact, there it is right there. So here is your feeding stage. He's called a trophozoite. That would be a trophozoite right there, which is the same thing as that right there. By the way, you can see some nice flagella. This guy's feeding, growing, reproducing, blah, blah, blah. Times get kind of tough. Goes out in feces, doesn't have a host, encysts. So you start to see the encystment right there. Has a hardened shell around it of a sort. Gets ingested by a new host, breaks out of its cyst, and now we're back to the trophozoite stage. So although the cyst is not really anything like an endospore structurally or chemically, the function of it is rather similar, although they don't exist dormant for hundreds of years like a endospore does. The view you're looking at here is in brain tissue, and that's an amoeba in a cyst form right there. These guys are chemoheterotrophic, just like we are, aerobic. Again, they reproduce in different ways. The view you're looking at up here in green on the wet mount, you're looking at conjugation, two together having sex. That's a sexual reproduction. I've already talked about multiple fission, but here's a good example. A couple of red blood cells being taken over. Those little yellow guys are each daughter cells of Plasmodium. And you can see that same thing over here on a transmission EM. Here is a red blood cell right there with, looks like two Plasmodia. And then right here you see a red cell that has got a large number of Plasmodia being produced inside of it. Also, many of them have get together and make a zygote. So here are the four main groups. There are more than this, but here are the four main groups. The amoebas. There's your amoeba right there, cytoplasmic streaming. I've already mentioned a ciliate, so here's a ciliate right there. And another ciliate right there. You can see cilia particularly up here at the top. Flagellate. Ooh, nice one right there. You can see that flagellum right there. Another flagellate. This is trypanosoma, which we looked at in lab. And here's another flagellate that I've talked about. This is Giardia, #1 protozoan digestive infection in the United States, diarrhea. And then I've mentioned Apicomplexa a couple of times, and you'll notice he's starred. He's got an asterisk. This whole group is a big pathogenic group. And most of these other guys really are not big pathogens for humans, at least in the United States. But the Apicomplexa group definitely is. And malaria is your best example, Plasmodium. And so here are a couple of cells that are being taken over by Plasmodium protozoa. Okay, so here's their importance, nothing else to say. Another shot right here, you're looking at a villus in the small intestine, for those of you that have had A&P. And look at all these little guys right down in here. This is Giardia. They have little suckers for attachment. Again, some of them very pathogenic, like the Apicomplexa. Most of the protozoa are free-living, though, and they really don't cause much disease in us in the scheme of things. Okay, so let's move over to the fungi. You're looking at budding yeast right here in this big picture, and an absolutely drop-dead picture of Aspergillus on the right showing chains of exospores. By the way, exospores, not endospores. The mushrooms are in this group. These are not really mushrooms. They are called morels, M-O-R-E-L-S. Exceptionally important to the food industry, particularly if you're a gourmet chef. They make a lot of sauces and soups, very expensive, $15, $25 a pound. You can get them at Central Market, kind of pricey though. So, we're in the area called mycology. Fungi live everywhere. Animals, you can see an example right over here on the fish being taken over. In soil, the view, there's mushrooms right here. Notice on this picture of the around the tree, these are mushrooms down at the bottom. It's called a fairy ring. You can see another one over here. A lot of the mushrooms have symbiotic relationships with tree roots, and notice that they're all growing around the tree roots of this particular tree. This view right here, you're looking with a UV lamp at a person's scalp, and this is tinea of the scalp, tinea capitis, or ringworm of the scalp. It fluoresces under UV light, by the way. That's why they're using it. Okay, so why are they important? Food. Mushrooms, I'm sure everybody eats them. They're important for food preparation. For example, penicillium fungus makes brie cheese and camembert cheese and Roquefort blue cheese. They're food spoilers. I'm sure you've seen oranges and lemons go bad, covered with mold in your refrigerator. They make a lot of antibiotics. Penicillium and cephalosporium makes cephalithins and various penicillin family drugs. They're important in genetic studies, decomposition. A few of them are pathogens, but frankly there's not more than about a dozen of the fungi that cause most of the fungal infections in humans. So this is what they look like. They exist pretty much in two forms. The yeast, which are unicellular, I showed you a picture before, and the moles, which have got hyphae. You see some hyphae right there. Here's another hypha right there. They're the fungal filaments that you see. A bunch of hyphae, when you're looking at it from far away, is called a mycelium, or plural mycelia, and that's what you're looking at right there. So when you pick up one of those lemons or limes that's gone bad in your refrigerator, is covered by a green mold, what you're seeing is mycelium. It's made up of hypha, though, if you could look at it microscopically. So, again, yeast, unicellular. Moles have hyphae, multicellular. Some fungi exist only in a yeast stage, and some exist only in a mole stage, and some can flip back and forth, dimorphic. They have cellulose and chitin in their walls, generally. They're chemoheterotropic, like you. Aerobic, extremely resistant to environment, but luckily most of them are free-living and don't interact with us. They're important as decayers. They decay wood, they decay trees, they decay your lemons, they decay everything. The name for that is a saprophyte. And again, another view of ringworm of the scalp right there. So they can do things asexually and sexually. Most of the time, they make asexual spores called exospores. Do not confuse those with endospores. Totally different. Totally. Exospores are for dissemination in the environment. They have nothing to do with hardiness, whereas endospores are. Notice different kinds of exospores over here. They come in different sizes and shapes. This is aspergillus right here, which you looked at in lab. These are little chains of blue spores coming off. They usually have something called a fruiting body. This is the fruiting body right here. Spores are coming off. Here's a fruiting body right here. And this is a container like a balloon full of spores. The spores are the little blue things that you see inside. Another view of spores right there. Many of these guys just bud like the yeast do. So here are daughter cells budding off mother cell. Many of them do sexual reproduction, where, again, two different things come together, fuse, producing a diploid organism. Again, pros and cons. Asexual for just dissemination and producing a new organism, whereas sexual reproduction, you get genetic variation, because it takes two to produce the new life. And just a look at sexual spores and how they're made by meiosis. This requires meiosis, by the way. In fact, you see that labeled down at the bottom of that picture. So, classification. Here are four major groups. Actually, three major groups, and then there's a garbage bag of them. So the zygomycota, or zygomycetes, the bread moles, like Rhizopus. We looked at it in lab. The division Ascomycota, Ascomycetes, Penicillium, and Aspergillus, as well as Saccharomyces yeast and Candida yeast are in this group. This is Ascomycete right there. And those are ascospores in pink. Then we've got the Basidiomycetes, and they're the mushrooms in their family. And here are some of their spores. And over here you're looking at the gill. You know, if you flip a mushroom over, you can see all these hundreds of gills on the underside of the cap. And this is the gill you see right here, and these are the spores in brown. You eat them, it's no big deal. And I mentioned there's a kind of a catch-all category of the guys that don't seem to be classified. They're missing a reproductive phase, and so they don't really know where to put them, which of the divisions, and they're called the deuteromycetes. The division Zygomycota, the bread moles. Rhizopus is an example. Again, you've looked at them in lab. There's a piece of bread with him growing on it, and you can see different examples of their sexual spores. Good example right there. And this thing right there is that thing, and this thing is that thing, and that thing is also these things that you see over here, and those guys right there. They also make sexual spores, and that's what's going on right here between two hypha. This is called a zygospore. It gets bigger and bigger, black, and that's why they're in a group called the Zygomycota. They make zygospores. Again, they're major decayers. They do cause a few human problems, but not a biggie group. Ascomycetes. This is where most of the fungal pathogens are. So you're looking at some of them right here. I don't have penicillium and aspergillus here, but they are also in the Ascomycota. Penicillium is not a big human pathogen, hardly ever, but aspergillus is. In fact, he's the one that's been associated with meningitis this fall, injected with steroid solutions from related to a pharmacy that did not use good aseptic technique in the solution preparation in Massachusetts, I believe. But also we've got Saccharomyces yeast in the group. We've got Candida albicans, the big yeast infection of women, vaginitis. Morels and truffles, although these may look like mushroom-like things to you, they are not. They're not. They're in this division, and the mushrooms are in a totally different division. By the way, morels, again, I mentioned already, but the truffles, these are the guys that are put in a lot of foods, cheeses and oils, and very, very expensive, way expensive, over $100 a pound. They are rooted out around the roots of certain types of trees, usually oaks. They use dogs to find them. So I'm not talking chocolate truffles here, by the way. Candida, which I've already mentioned, which is a yeast in women, also causes thrush in babies. Look at that whitish material around the mouth. Also associated with immunosuppressed. Not just babies, pregnant women, and regular women. Okay, here's the mushrooms, and so there are other related guys. The basidiomycetes, bracket fungi, mushrooms, things like that, puffballs. Again, not much in the way of human pathogens, although Amanita, which is the deadly toadstool, can cause death very quickly. It's got a really potent neurotoxin. And there are a lot of mushrooms, by the way, that produce toxins that produce hallucinations. This is the group that is not quite classified. There are a lot of guys in this group that are pathogens. Ringworms, ringworm fungi are in this group. And that's what you're looking at is ringworm here, or tinea, T-I-N-E-A. Lichens, these are not medically important. They're important out in nature. You've probably run across them. They grow on bark and things like that. They're kind of an odd organism in that there are two things growing together, an ascomycete and algae or photosynthetic bacteria, the cyanobacteria. They're important as pioneer organisms and indicators of pollutants. Okay, so fungal infections. I've got a variety that you can see here. Cutaneous infections. Look at the, let me go ahead and pull all of them up here. Cutaneous infection, you see right here. There's a ringworm of the nail, really hard to get rid of. I don't have a subcutaneous here. I have some systemic though. This view right here is a fungal infection involving the brain. Systemic means spreads into different organs around the body. Here is a pneumonia caused by a fungus. Here's candida again in the mouth, thrush. Here's another systemic one right here. This is candida again in a baby. By the way, it also causes diaper rash, although that's not systemic. And this picture down here is kind of interesting. Somebody brought it to me. This is a guy who got a fungal infection. It destroyed his eye and part of his face. Look at it on the left. He had a prosthetic eye put in and tissue built up right over here. It was a rather rare fungus people don't generally get. And again, they play a big part as opportunistic organisms, Aspergillus particularly. The algae. I'm not going to talk about them except fleetingly. They're not big causes of disease, but I did want to mention a couple things related to them. Look up here at sushi at the top right. You've probably had sushi. The wrapping of sushi is algae. Nice view of algae at the bottom right. You've got a pink algae surrounded by orange bacteria. Diatoms, these little beautiful glass-like arrangements of algae you see at the bottom left. They're called golden algae. They're important for a lot of different reasons. They're photosynthetic. They fix nitrogen, so they're helpful in the environment. They're decomposers. They're added to food. For example, agar. Look at the agar powder at the bottom left. You know that's to make bacteriological media, but agar can also be used to food as a solidifying agent. The stuff over in the bag in green is diatomaceous earth. A lot of people use it to, it comes as a powder, like a flour, and a lot of people use it on their rose bushes and other types of plants to get rid of aphids and other little insects. There are a few pathogens in the group. The guy up at the top right is a dinoflagellate with a flagellum and causes a lot of fish kills, and if people eat the fish, you can ingest the toxins and get diarrhea. Some of them are neurotoxins. So there are a few human diseases, but not many. And then the thing at the bottom, if you look at the very bottom, there's a bag of sodium alginate. Alginate comes from a green and brown algae. It's like a powder. It's used in dental situations quite often to make forms. It starts out as a kind of a putty-like material. You add water to it and it solidifies, and they make bite planes and things based on these forms. They don't make the bite planes out of the alginate. They use the alginate to make the forms. It hardens on your teeth, and they take it off, and then they can make dentures and other things to fit your mouth. The worms. We've done this in lab already, so I'm not going to spend very much time. You're looking at worms and infections related to them. I already mentioned the CDC website with the worm and protozoa information. There's the URL right there. We're in the area called parasitology, again with the protozoa. They're also in parasitology. These guys live everywhere. Most of them are free living, though, thankfully, not in us. But there are a lot of worms that are human pathogens. They sometimes can go through skin, like hookworms can go through your feet, through the skin between your toes. They have a variety of attachment structures, like the guy up at the top, schistosoma. You can see two suckers there. They can make hundreds of thousands of eggs every day. It's amazing. In fact, you're looking at eggs. You've got about 5 of them there. Very different from each other. And they have very complicated life cycles. I'll show you some examples. Okay, so here's a couple of life cycles of the worms, and let me point out a couple of things here. Get rid of that. Okay, so this is a tinea right here, a tapeworm. This happens to be a pig tapeworm. So humans will ingest infected pork. The larva, which was in the pork, gets down into the intestine and it elongates into an adult worm. The worm is able to make eggs and sperm. It produces zygotes. These zygotes The eggs are fertilized. They go out into the ground. You know, a lot of people defecate into the ground, or fecal contamination of ground eventually. Pigs come along, ingest the eggs. It insists in their muscles, and the whole cycle goes again. Rather complicated. You need two hosts for this. This is dicrocilium over here. It's not a human pathogen, but in cows. Look at all the hosts. You got a cow host. You got a snail host. You got an ant host. Really fascinating life cycle. You might take a look at it. It's very cool. It causes the ants to move up on grass so they can be eaten by a cow. Many of the worms are hermaphroditic, like tapes. They make both eggs and sperm. Some of the worms exist as two sexes. For example, down here at the bottom you see schistosoma. Again, we saw it in lab. Schistosoma. The male is the big boy, and his female is the little girl that's kind of peeking out right there. He kind of curls up around her, so you got two of them together. I mentioned that these girls, can produce a lot of eggs. Look at this body. It's packed full of eggs. Those little individual circles you see in their eggs. Another egg up here. I don't think there's anything else that I need to talk about here. They're chemoheterotrophic like we are, and aerobic like we are. So, flatworms, platyhelminthes, trematodes, and cestodes. So, cestodes, the tapeworms. This is Tinea right there. You looked at him in lab. He's got hooks and suckers. Oop, put one too many eyes in there. You can see his suckers. Here is Tinea also. That's his scolex. That's that thing right there. And these things are called percolotids. They produce eggs. So here is a percolotid in more detail. Lots of ovary and testes material in there. The trematodes are the flukes. You got two examples here. This is schistosoma again. There's this little female poking her head out of his copulating groove. And this is fasciola right here, and right here in the liver, attached to the liver. They're the flukes. Then we have the nematodes, roundworms. So let's start at up at the top right. These little small things you see in the intestine, they look like tiny white pins, I guess we'll call them, are actually pinworms. It's anaerobius, the common pinworm. Then you've got whipworms right below it. Then moving over to the left, you've got heartworms in a dead heart taken out of a dead animal, dead dog. That's Dirofilaria. And up at the top left, you see Trichinella, which is another one associated with pork. Undercooked pork is not something you should eat. Lots of different infections, mostly GI tract infections, but sometimes found in blood. For example, here's a heartworm in blood up at the top in a blood sample. Trichinella over at the bottom right. And they can be transmitted lots of different ways, by contact, direct contact, person to person, by mosquito, by flea, by any number of things, in infected food. We talked about arthropods in lab, so I'm not going to spend any time on them. You know about the arachnids in insects, 8 legs versus 6 legs, wings in insects, no wings in the arachnids. Body form is different. So, beautiful little picture of a body louse right there. I think you can see his 8 legs. And here's a tick, another arachnid right there. And I've told you in parenthesis what infections they are related to in the transmission. Here's an insect right there, and here's a mosquito insect, and here's a flea insect, and a carrier deer fly, carrier of Lyme disease. And again, they can be vectors for a whole variety of pathogens of different kinds. And that's it.